Perfect. So tonight's talk, Snails Aren't All Bad News, is going to be given by Tom Walker. He's the Honorary President of the Archaeological Society of Great Britain and Ireland, which is one of the longest established societies in the world devoted to the study of mollusks. And I'm going to stop my screen share now, hand you over to Tom Walker for Snails Aren't All Bad News.
I need to try and get that up. Just waiting for it to come.
Yeah, so it's sharing, and if we're just going to go on to slideshow view.
There we are. Right. I hope people can see that now.
It's perfect, yes.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to give the talk. I'm slightly overwhelmed by the number of people present, and I hope you find it interesting. I would just correct one thing that Maria said. Although when she asked me to do the talk, I was president of the Archaeological Society, I'm pleased to say I handed that over in April to Ben Rowson, who is the curator of mollusks at the National Museums of Wales. But I'm still very much involved with the society. Now, I hope you can see the screen there. And as you will see, I have changed the title slightly in that I have put slugs in as well in the title, because I suspect that it is slugs that most people are worried about in their gardens more than snails. I'm just going to start by giving an overview of what are slugs and snails. Now, I may be teaching the converted, but I hope not. In the mollusks come in the phylum Mollusca, that's all shells and snails, and they are divided up into 7 classes, of which the great majority are the gastropods, which are single-shelled animals, usually with a coiled shell, but not always. There's a picture of a limpet here on the left, which most would know is not coiled. But this class includes the land snails and slugs, and some of you may be unaware that there are slugs in the sea as well, called nudibranchs, which are mostly extremely beautiful and colourful. And then we have the bivalves, the 2-shelled animals, which you will frequently find on the seashore. We have the chitons, which are like coat of mail shells with 8 plates. We have tusk shells, named, as you can see from the illustration, obviously in resemblance to elephant tusks. And then we have the cephalopods, which is squid, octopus, and nautilus, and allied to the ammonites of the past. And then there are another 2 very rare, small numbered families which live in the deep sea, which nobody's ever going to encounter. But I'm going to be really concentrating on the British non-marine shells, which is my specialty. I'm not very knowledgeable about the seashells. Now, in Britain at the moment, there are currently 233 different species of mollusks with shells or slugs. And you can see the numbers there of those that on land, 43 slugs, and then there's a good number that live in freshwater or brackish water, and 33 bivalves that live only in fresh water. There are no land bivalves, either in the sea or non-marine. And the illustrations just give some idea of what these look like. Now, you're all used to seeing snails, but only about 8% that you're ever likely to see just by the casual eye are larger than 10 millimeters, which means the vast majority of snails are so small that they will only be seen by active searching. Some of the large ones that we'll see, obviously everybody knows the garden snail, and the white-lipped snail and the brown-lipped snail are very, very common. The largest of all our non-marine shells, gastropods that is the Roman snail, which can reach up to 45 millimeters. That's about 2 inches in diameter. And I'll be talking a little bit about that later. And then there are the smaller ones, some of them which are very long and thin, as opposed to the majority of shells which are wider than they are high. Sometimes these can occur in huge numbers. These pictures One on the left is a thing called a sand snail, which is a coastal species, typically in sand dunes. And you can see vast numbers there are there. And then there's one on the right, which is called Monaca cantiana, the Kentish snail. And I went and had a look only a few days ago locally, and on just one bush, I found 8, none of which were eating the leaves that they were on, which is obviously good news. Some of them are minute, though. 40% are so tiny that they're hardly possible to see. One of them, a fairly rare shell, which lives in particularly reed beds along the rivers, particularly the Thames, is this world snail, which is only a maximum of 2.7 millimeters in size. On the bottom left is our smallest snail, which I use as a test to see whether my eyesight is failing. If I can still see that in the wild, then I know I'm not going blind, which is quite reassuring. And there are another couple there of very, very tiny shells, which only will be found either by collecting material and sieving it, or by very careful examination of undergrowth or leaf litter. Now, one of the things that everybody wants to know is, what do snails eat? We all think that snails will eat everything we put in the garden, but that's actually not so. There are very few species which are wholly dependent on healthy vegetation. And of course, the worst offender of snails is our common garden snail, the Cornu aspersum. And that is reputedly our only serious herbivorous snail. And I have a quote there that studies have also determined that snails are especially attracted to pheromones that plants put out when they're harmed. So any damaged vegetation is more likely to be predated. But the majority of our shells will either live on the decaying dead matter, withering leaves. A lot live on algae and lichen. This one here is a shell which is very unusual to be seen climbing a tree. And I'm not quite sure why it did it, but it's presumably to browse on the lichen and algae that are on this ash tree. Slugs, of course, are much more of a problem. We all know that. Sorry, I'm getting rid of a screen coming up on the screen. But of the 43 species of slug, there are only 7 which are classified as being particular pests. And some of them are shown here. I find slugs very difficult to identify. Others find it easy. And it's very easy to assume that any slug you see in the garden is bad news, is going to gobble up your vegetables. But this is not so. As I say, only 7 are considered as serious pests, and far more are occasional pests. They may be found eating your things, but on the whole, they are not going to do serious damage. And among those is one that you're going to see very often, the Archaeolical, the large black slug. And that is very similar to other species in this family, the Arionidae, and many of them share characteristics and can really only be separated by careful examination by an expert, or even by dissection is sometimes needed to look at the genitalia of the different species. But some of these, you will see, but don't get too concerned about. And others are considered as not really of concern. One of the very common ones is this leopard slug. You'll see it in nearly all gardens everywhere. But it's a voracious predator of other insects, other animals, insects that are a nuisance, aphids and so on, and actually should be encouraged in the garden. And other ones there that I show some pictures of, you really do not need to be concerned about. The green cellar slug has been a study by one of my colleagues who was recently at Wisley RHS Gardens, because this is a species which is now getting fairly scarce, but she has managed to get citizen science surveys done and shown that it is actually not really quite as bad as previously thought. And if you want to know more about slugs, because they're the things that most people are worried about, there's this wonderful book produced by AIDGAP, the Field Studies Council, and I'll mention that at the end as well. But it's well worth getting to know more about slugs. But so what's the good news? Well, I took this picture 2 or 3 weeks ago on the turning over just the little old rug that I have covering my compost heap, and I found 5 different species of slugs and 2 species of snails just in one evening. And these are the ones that are going to taking a major part in recycling all your compost, all your garden rubbish, along with earthworms and other insects there. These are really good news, and they should be encouraged. Certainly, that's my view. And of course, they're food for a variety of animals as well. Birds, hedgehogs, frogs, and mice. I thought I'd put a picture in there of a mouse-predated snail, but somehow it seems to have missed. But these are to be encouraged. And it's very good to have these in your garden because they are essential for some of these animals to give them extra food. They provide a home. This is a mason bee. There was a lot of publicity a year or so ago about these being found and filmed. I personally have never seen them, but it is an important home for these bees, and other species use these as well. And if you look on various websites, you can see wonderful videos of these things actually building their nests and making their home for their eggs, which they then seal in and then bury in the soil beneath a mound of litter to hide them from predators. And I just put up here now one set of pictures that I've taken. Although these are all dead shells, they provide wonderful concealment for caddisfly larvae. And these are just some that I've collected over recent years. And you can show the great variety of shells, nearly all freshwater shells, which these animals use to cover their cases. And have a look at them. They're really very beautiful, some of these. And of course, we all know that caddisflies use numerous other materials to cover their shells, but mollusks are ones that particularly interest me. I've not tried to identify all the species there, but there's probably about 10 or 15 different species on those. Now, what can you do about them? Well, you can't do a huge amount very easily. People have tried collecting up snails and slugs and throwing them over the fence into the neighbour's garden, and hopefully they're not going to come back. But there have been surveys done where people have marked individual shells, and to everybody's surprise, they will come back to their original home if they are deposited round about 20 meters away. They'll find their way back unless you put a physical barrier in the way. So planting on your neighbour won't always solve the problem. You can choose plants that are less palatable to slugs and snails. Some of these are well known. I haven't actually got a list there, but you want to avoid things like hostas, which we know are particularly attractive to snails. You want to encourage predators like the ones I've just shown you on the images there. Make your gardens animal friendly, bird friendly. Hedgehogs, encourage them if you've got them. Don't get rid of the mice, but obviously don't let them into your house. Some of the slug repellent slants I put there, which I have found, I can't say I particularly tried them myself, but that's what's recommended. And then, of course, domestic fowl are known to eat these things. Particularly ducks are very good at eating slugs, and even take the odd snail as well. So if you've got a garden that you can have these in, that's good news. People have tried all kinds of deterrents, for instance, copper tape, eggshells, grit, all those. And although some people believe they're of help, it's been shown by the LNHS has done research on these particularly, that actually these are of very little help, and they may give you a feeling of improving things, but the slugs will still get past them. And then, of course, there's biological control. You can use nematode worms, which are used commercially quite a lot. They're non-selective for species, but they get in through the mantle of the shells and of the snails, particularly in slugs, and they will kill them fairly quickly. But most people are not going to find them very practical in certainly smaller gardens. Slug pellets, of course, are widely used, but again, just like with other forms of treatment, they are non-selective and will affect other insects particularly as well. And if you do wish to use them, try and use organic slug pellets rather than the ones that use metaldehyde and other toxic chemicals. Now, I'm going to move off from that a little and tell you some of the other things that have interested me in particular. Now, as we heard, I have been involved with the Conchological Society for many years, and one of its main activities, apart from just doing surveys around places, is to keeping records of as many finds of observations of mollusks as possible. And we've got well over 250,000 records on the database now, non-marine that is, and there's a vast number more of marine records dating back to the early 19th century and continually being added to, with nearly 20,000 just added last year alone. And one example of doing this is a survey I was involved with. This is a fairly rare shell, which occurs, you can see the little red dots in one of the atlases from the National Biodiversity Network, which shows where these have been recorded. It's a species only in old woodland, which is undisturbed by man. And on the Conchological Society website, there were only 83 records in 10 years. And then one of our members thought it was time to try and update this and encourage people to go out and looking at sites where it had previously been recorded. And in 1 year alone, we nearly quadrupled the total number of records. And that is very encouraging. They are there, but some of the sites I looked at were being recorded in the earliest 20th century in particular, have now been fully developed. The habitats have gone. And of course, with all forms of flora and fauna, habitat change is a major problem. But these things are still there if you go and look for them. Another survey that I have been involved with was in Blenheim Park, where there's a wood on the southern side of the estate called High Park, which is an old oak forest. It has the largest stand of ancient oak trees in the whole of Europe, some of which are absolutely magnificent. And we were encouraged to get involved with a survey that took in place all the biota and all the fauna and flora on this large site, and it's led by Alias Fardion, who is an oak tree expert from Kew. And I was involved in the mollusk surveys, and over a period of 3 years, we made 13 visits at different times of the year, and well over 1,000 records of species. And just as an example of this is what we could do, here's one particular snail called Ariantha arbostorum, and we were able to document all the sites that we found it. All the dots refer to the particular places that we visited. Since this was an oak forest, we were encouraged to record whether they were under a tree or not under trees, and the blue dots are those which are recorded actually associated with the oak trees. But it was present in plenty of other sites. The red dots showing it sites that are not under a tree, but it's a species that lives in shady areas, so it's in leaf litter, under leaves, and so on. But with this particular species, shown in yellow, are all the places we visited where it was not present. And we found some where it was present in nearly all places, and others where it's only present in 1 or 2. And I'm delighted to say that that whole survey is being published in a book called The Natural History of Blenheim's High Park, which is due to be released next month. And for those who are interested in the biota of any fairly wild site. I would strongly recommend it. I'm not biased on that because I haven't seen anything except our own mollusk chapter, but I'm hoping that it's going to be a really interesting book to tell what just does exist in places that have not yet been spoiled by mankind. Another story is about the Newbury snail, the Newbury bypass snail. Those of you of a certain age might remember that in the 60s, they wanted to build a bypass around the town of Newbury in Berkshire. And this was, it produced major problems when they found a rare snail, this thing called the Tiger mullinsiana, the Moulin's world snail, which is a tiny thing, 1/10 of an inch long, 2.4 millimeters only, was found living in one of the valleys that the new bypass was going to cross. And there were massive protests. Some of you remember a man called Swampy who lived in a tree for a long period, and Swampy's tree is still there. It led to a court case for people to try and get the whole bypass stopped, but the bypass is still there now, and they failed. And a compromise was reached with the courts to try and relocate the snail to another site in an adjacent valley. And that was duly done to the River Lambourne, which is about a couple of miles north of the site where they were living. And one of my colleagues recorded at the time that this is not really the answer, but just an experiment. And another one said that he was pretty sure it was going to fail, that it was just a publicity stunt. And I'm sad to say that both these predictions proved correct, in that just 10 years later, the shale was declared extinct at the relocation site. It wasn't properly managed, it became dried up, and it's now gone. And as far as I'm aware, it is not there now. But there's really no tragedy. It is present. I have been looked for it at Thatcham on the reed beds there, which is only a few miles from the site, and it is still there in abundance. And we went up to another little nature reserve just last Saturday, looking forward to a place called Withymead, a bit further up the Thames from where I live in Reading, and we found it there living quite happily. So despite what happened at Newbury, this is a species which is not threatened. And really, it was a publicity event rather than a serious biological concern. I'm going to turn now, another area that has interested me, although I'm talking really about British non-marine, a few slides just to show the other uses to which shells have been put. And they have been present in archaeological sites dating back many, many thousands of years. There are some there from some caves in South Africa, which have been dated to 75,000 years old. And these thing called tick bead shells are presumably part of a necklace, and those holes have been deliberately drilled to string them on some kind of hide string or hair string, and presumably worn around a necklace. And this abalone shell has been found to contain paint, ochre paint, which people used to cover their faces with, decorate, excuse me, decorate themselves with. And people have analysed some of the residue in this and proven that it is there for ochre paint. Trumpets, we've probably heard everybody of shell trumpets. They're still made and used in some countries, in India particularly. But here's one that comes from some caves in the French Pyrenees, which is 18,000 years old, of a species which still occurs in the Mediterranean. There's a pendant here from the Americas, from the Aztec world, now getting into a little bit more modern times, a scallop there, which again was drilled out at the top to make a pendant. And then in much more modern times, just pre-Columbian, there is a large marine shell used as some kind of a bowl, just with one side taken off. We use it as food. in archaeological times. I can be talking a bit later about more modern times. But this was down in Cornwall that I was involved with. And on one little tiny island in North Cornwall, we found this limpet midden holding quite a large number of shells. And it was associated with a burial chamber. And the bones in that were dated to the between 1380 and 1110 BC from the Bronze Age. And these shells presumably were part of the food from, the occupants of the island at the time, either for themselves or perhaps even used for fish bait. And these middens, shell middens, can get absolutely ginormous. This is a picture which I have taken from the web of a midden which was used for getting on to 2,000 years or more, and must contain many, many millions of shells. And the fact that it's been added to over millennia proves that by taking the shells properly managed, you're not going to do any harm to the overall populations. Roman times, some of the mosaics at Pompeii, wonderful mosaics showing that they were using as food not only fish, but there's octopus there as well, and there are other ones showing squid. And then, of course, we all know that oysters regularly turn up on archaeological sites. I've seen them in Roman sites that I've been involved with near here in Reading. This particular one comes from an archaeological site in Lincolnshire. And it's interesting that these are all marine oysters, and so they have been transported quite long distances, often to inland Roman sites where they have been a choice food. I've said I've been involved with archaeology, and shells are really important in looking at the Paleoenvironment. Now, mollusks survive in alkaline sediments, being largely calcium carbonate. If it's in acid sediments, they will be dissolved and disappear. Whereas pollen, which is frequently used for looking at the Paleoenvironments, survives in acid sediments and not alkaline. So they're very complementary in analyses of looking at what kind of environment there was in times past. And this is just one from this site down in Cornwall that I was involved with. And on the right is just a selection of shells from the sand from 900 or so BC. So we're talking about the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, and you can see how well preserved they can be. This was in sand dunes, and you just had to wash them, and one can analyze all of these and have a look, because different species occur in different habitats. For go back in freshwater shells, you get marshy ones. And so land shells, you get different ones occur in marsh, and these are just some pictures to show the variety that we have. Some will live only in shade, some in Catholic areas, and live anywhere, sort of Catholic, they're not worried about the habitats. And then there are other ones that just live in open country. And some, particularly the one at the very bottom right, is a very good indicator, because that occurs in abundance in grass that is grazed, in short grass. So when you find that in abundance, it's one of the signs that there have been grazing there, probably by sheep, however old it is. So it's not only just looking at what was growing, it's looking at sometimes what the use of land is. Similarly, in freshwater, we have species that live in different habitats, whether it be moving water, in ditches, some of those, some which can live more or less anywhere, and then others that just live in backwaters, stagnant waters, ones which most of us wouldn't consider very healthy. Some of these actually require periods of drying out in the summer so that they can survive in areas that cease to be waterlogged in winter, in summer, and again give a very good idea of what conditions might be like at various times. And an example of this, this is a site in Cornwall, which I was involved in the study of. This is a cliff at Gwithian, and a close-up shows at the very top of this cliff a line of stones, and it's lying beneath sand dune. And the question was, were these part of a wall, perhaps? And if they were, could they have been related to the mining industry from late medieval times, 17th and 18th century, the very abundant tin mines in the area, or could they go back much earlier? And what we did, we analysed a mollusk column similar to the picture I showed you earlier to look at the content of the mollusks at the different levels. And down at the bottom, which is just over 1 metre in depth, the grey is species that are associated with woodland, were over 50%. So the woodland ones are grey, the open country ones are green, and the pink are those that can live in any old sites. And one of those species there was a species which is now extinct in Britain, and I'll just refer to that a bit later. Dating of the shells showed that this was all around about 1500 to 2000 BC. And the marked change in that time from the woodlands, the mainly grey, to green shows a marked change in the environment. And this corresponds very well to the clearances that occurred in woodland round about the end of the Mesolithic, Neolithic clearances from the woodland to make it much more open country. And this is a useful study which we could prove from the mollusks that this was a prehistoric site and not related to the tin mining industry. Having said that one of those is now extinct, there are several species which were present in the early Holocene which are now extinct. One of them is a thing called Discus ruderatus, which is very closely related to a species which is now very common called the world shell or the Discus rotundatus. And it's probable that this disappeared in the early Holocene due to slightly warming climates. Another one, the one on the right, this is the one that was dated on the sections I've just shown you, also disappeared in the very early Holocene across the south of Britain. But just at this one site in Cornwall at Gwithian, it has survived up to the late Bronze Age, which has been shown by carbon dating of it. And why it should have survived just in this one habitat is a complete mystery. There was presumably some kind of microhabitat which it liked and had disappeared elsewhere. We don't know, but it certainly doesn't exist now. More recent extinctions, a couple here, which have been last seen 20 years ago or so. The one on the right is a river in Bedfordshire, and on the left is in Norfolk. And these sadly seem to have disappeared, probably because of pollution in the waters. We don't know. One that I have been involved in looking at is this lovely little thing called the Thames Ramshorn. The map shows its locations that has been recorded on the Archaeological Society database all the way up the Thames. The red dots are there, but it is now worried that it is extinct because the last recorded living specimen was seen in the River Pang, which is down here, bottom left, in 2011. And I have done surveys trying to look in the River Pang, the red dots where it's been recorded in the past, and the blue dots are where that I have been wading up and down the river to try and find it. The bit in the middle I couldn't get into because these are private lands which I didn't have permission for. And I have yet to say that I failed to find this as a living shell. There were several dead ones. There was one that still had what's called the periostracum, the slightly horny covering of the shell in one site near the top. So probably only dead a year or two, but we don't know. But other people have searched other sites, and I'm sad to say that it looks like this is now gone. On this particular river, there is pollution, overspill from sewage works higher up, but probably even more responsible is the signal crayfish, which is now there in abundance, and that gobbles anything up that it can find, and it may be responsible for the disappearance of this and perhaps others. But of course, in compensation, there have been introductions. The one on the left is a common, very common now, snail in sand dune areas particularly. It's been recorded from a few inland sites, the pointed snail, Coccicella acuta, and carbon dating of that in part of my work has shown that that actually was introduced to Britain around about 2000 BC. And its probably was introduced first into Cornwall and then is spread further and further as time passes. The one in the middle is a much less frequent shell, was only first recorded in Britain in 1975 down in Torquay. But in one site that I was asked to look at, we found some that in an archaeological Bronze Age site, but it had been covered, all the little pits, post holes from the old buildings had been covered with sand washed down the hill in Newquay in Cornwall. And dating of that placed it in the early medieval period. And there are some living shells a bit higher up the hill now, but it's likely that this one was actually been around for much longer and just not observed. The picture I showed you earlier of this sandhill snail was first described by a chap called Thomas Pennant in the 1770s and well documented in St Ives in Cornwall. And then for some reason records seemed to disappear and nobody recorded it again until the 1950s. And now that is an extremely common shell around the southwest of Britain, particularly well up into Wales, and it is spreading very fast. We've all heard of the Roman snail, but for many people don't know that not only that, which the Romans introduced, but we have them to thank for our garden pest, the garden snail as well. It's now everywhere. They probably brought both of these in for food. Certainly the Roman snail is a big thing that's eaten, but I'll be referring to this a little bit in a moment. There's one modern introduction, which I want to mention. This beautiful little snail called Papilifera papillaris was observed in the Cliveden National Trust property. On this little wall, you can see the picture on the left, this balustrade. In 2004, a volunteer gardener there saw this snail, didn't recognize it, and showed it to people who were able to identify it. And it's there in abundance. But what is interesting is that this balustrade was bought by the Astor family from Italy. It came from the Villa Borghese there, shown bottom right, and that came in 1896. And what is remarkable is that this snail was there for 108 years before anybody recognized it. And I find that quite extraordinary. It's there in abundance. It doesn't travel far. It is only on that wall and around the base of the house there. And so far, this has only been found in one other site in Britain, and that's on Brownsea Island in Poole Harbour. And it presumably came over again with Roman statuary. It's not a native. It's doing no harm whatsoever. It's living on the algae. And it's just a very interesting observation. There's this slug as well, which is a recent introduction to Britain, first observed in 2004, a completely new species to science. And how it got here, how long it had been here, we don't know. But that was first observed only 20 years ago. And we now have numerous records of it, mostly in South Wales, but it's also been observed much wider, far afield as Cornwall and Derbyshire. And it's probably come from the mountains of the Crimea. It probably came over with food imports. We don't know, plant imports. And there's another couple here, a couple of slugs, which you may well see. And the one on the left is both three-band slugs. The one called the Balkan slug was first observed in the hothouses in Edinburgh Botanical Gardens in 1934, and the one on the right in 1936, again, presumably coming with plants. And they stayed quite happily living in glass houses only for getting on for, that's 50 years, 45 years, until they decided that the climate was right, whether it was they could now live in the winter or what, I don't know, but they're now outside. And the one on the left has 165 records on the last database I was able to look at, whereas the one on the right is now well over 1,500 records and spread throughout the country. And undoubtedly, they will spread more as time goes on. But I can assure you, these are not going to do any harm to your greenery. There are introductions, though, of much greater concern, particularly some of the freshwater species. The zebra mussel is now present in many waterways in southern Britain, and it often chokes up the waterways, chokes up weirs, and outcompetes other species. Other ones there have come in more recent times, or at least first been observed. The Chinese mystery snail, the one in the middle, is a great big thing. It's about 2 to 3 inches long. And that, again, is causing big concern down in the south, in East Sussex particularly, that it'll choke up waterways, ditches, and outcompete other species which are in threat. Now, one of the things I've been looking at recently is other aliens. I mentioned the 2 slugs earlier that were only in greenhouses. And some 10 years ago, I was visiting the Oxford Botanic Gardens and noticed that in the glass house, of the lily house, there were some species which I never seen before, and eventually able to identify these as species which are not known in the wild in Britain. And I thought, well, what other ones are there? And it's an area that's fairly little documented. So over the last 10 years, I have visited 56 different hot houses which are open to the public, glass houses in botanical gardens, zoos, butterfly parks, particularly throughout Britain and Ireland, to look for these alien species. And when I tell people I'm searching for aliens, it just confirms that I really am fairly mad. But I found 16 different alien species throughout these. And some of these most of them are completely new to the sites where I've recorded them, because nobody's done surveys. The only proper surveys that have been kept going are in Cambridge, Whitsunday, Kew, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. The one I illustrate there is the most common I found, a nice little shell that's not to do any harm, found in 17 different locations, shown in the green on that map. What's interesting is that shown in black at the Cotswold Wildlife and Marble Zoo are 2 institutions that denied me access to have a look, which much to my annoyance, because they work on the basis that if you're going to take species away, it shouldn't be allowed. I made it clear to them that some of these tiny ones I've got to look at under the microscope, but they wouldn't allow any living things to be taken away, which is, in my view, rather short-sighted. Here are some of the other aliens that I found, and I've just put up some illustrations of ones which occur in London areas, although, as you saw, I've looked over the whole country. Some of these are there fairly scarcely. Other ones, the bottom right, is there in vast numbers. In the Eden project, in 1 litre of litter that I took, there are over 120 different living animals. And if this gets out into the wild, if our winters get warm enough that it can survive, I think that might be a real danger of outcompeting. The one on the left, that little Galella Io, this lovely orange thing, was actually very first described in a glass house in Britain as new species to science. It's now known that it probably comes from Nigeria, but that was very first described at Kew and Edinburgh, and then it's nearly gone. And I spent a long time searching for it. It hasn't been observed in Edinburgh for many, many years. At Cambridge, it was observed about 7 or 8 years ago, but unfortunately their heating then disappeared, went off in the winter, and that population died. And I spent a whole day at Kew searching for it, And just as I was about to leave the palm house, found this single specimen, obviously very alive and well. So I know it's still there. And I hope this very beautiful little tiny thing does survive. I am pleased to say that we did find one species new to Britain. This little thing doesn't have an English name, Learditia samoensis, which I found in the RHS gardens at Wisley, growing on the damp area in the tropical zone. The red dot on the map shows where it comes in Samoa, where it originates from. And in the whole literature that I've searched very carefully, it's only been observed at other island sites throughout the Indo-Pacific, the first west being the Maldive Islands, south of India. And I'm pleased to say that this seems to be the only population ever recorded outside Asia. It's a well-breeding population. I've seen it there for 10 years, but it's not been recorded anywhere else in Europe, Africa, or the Americas. So that's quite exciting. And it's now up to other people to try and find it. It's very similar to numerous other species, but I can assure you this has been confirmed, the identification by DNA analysis. Another thing which interests me is that you can tell how old shells are. And it may amuse you to know that the longest living non-commensal animal known in the world is a shell. This is one that occurs, as your name might imply, the Arctica Icelandica, in particularly the North Atlantic. And one dredged a good many years ago now. The growth rings on it, which I'll mention in the next slide, have showed that it was 507 years old, which is longer than anything else other than things like fungi. And how do you tell how old a shell is? Well, you can see growth lines on many shells, and you can see 2 winter growth lines on that cockle shell there. But what is astonishing is that if you cut that into sections, you can not only tell the annual growth line, but there are lots and lots of growth lines between. And the picture, the scanning electron microscope image on the bottom left shows ridges which correspond to each tide. So you can actually see the growth for twice a day for these individual shells, which I find quite remarkable. And this has been put to good use in some of the archaeological work. In this particular site at Norminda in Denmark, they looked at oysters, and looking at the growth rate, how much growth had been since the winter when it doesn't grow, they were able to tell very closely when the individual shells were harvested, and therefore when this site was actually occupied by ancient humans. And that is in the Mesolithic site, that one, going back many thousands of years. Now, of course, for humans, modern humans, shells can be a food. This is the queen conch, which anybody, if you've been to the Caribbean, you may well have had conch fritters or conch chowder. And it's now on the CITES list, so you're not allowed to collect it from the wild, but there are now, it still does happen, of course, but there are now farms for it. And just to show, this is in Jamaica, where there's a huge midden of shells there. The picture on the bottom right shows that where they make a hole to cut the muscle of the animal to get it out and then turn it into food. But fortunately now, this isn't endangered at all. And any food that you get containing the conch chowder or conch fritters in the Caribbean will come from farm species, or should do. Some years ago, I was in Bristol and saw this restaurant sign, bistro sign, and I thought, that's funny. I've never heard of wolfish, and went in and inquired and found that they were serving up the similar to our common garden snail. And I thought, why is this called a wolfish? And it all goes back to Catholic times, when the Catholic Church forbade people to eat meat on certain days, and only eat not meat. And their definition of not meat is very curious. Fish and all cold-blooded animals are not meat, and all water animals, including, for example, beaver and capybara, are classified as not meat, so they were allowed. birds were sometimes forbidden, except the barnacle goose. And you may be interested to know that the term barnacle goose comes from the old medieval concept that these geese actually born from goose barnacles, which you can find frequently on the seashore. And that's why they weren't classified as meat. Very strange nowadays. So come back to why wallfish. Garden snails in the winter, they sort of go into a hibernation, and they'll often collect in vast numbers. And in Victorian times, certainly they would go and collect buckets full of these things for the food market, and hence called the wallfish. And nowadays, if you go and eat snails in a restaurant, they're unlikely to be the common garden snail, the one on the left at the bottom. The Roman snail, which was probably brought for food, is now on the endangered list. It's actually a criminal offence even to touch it if you find it in the wild. But you will be provided with a large variety of our common garden snail, which comes from Morocco and is now farmed. And just very quickly, because I'm well aware time is running out, just one other topic. People have heard of Tyrian purple, comes from this murex shell, only worn by emperors and senators, exceedingly expensive. But what is interesting, that in Britain, we also are able to produce our own purple dye from a very common shell found on our seashores, from this gland, which you can extract. And that's some that I caught and opened the shell and took it out. And it's been used in some of our medieval documents. That one here has purple in the lettering, which has been proven to come from this shell. And I was involved in looking at some shells from an early medieval site in Cornwall, which are the ones on the left, which I thought may have been taken, broken open to get the this particular gland out. And the illustration on the right is some modern shells I took and smashed up with a hammer, and you can see they broke in exactly the same way. And those are the ones on the right that I broke to get out the dye shown in the bit of linen above with the purple. And I think it's pretty good evidence that those did come, the original ones were used for making dye. Very quickly, paintings. You're all familiar with that painting. But snails, shells are shown on paintings back to Roman times in Pompeii, that another version of Venus probably lying on a shell. Very popular shells from the later medieval times, when shell collecting was a big thing. And that's just one from a Dutch painter. And another one showing Midsummer Night's Fairies. And I rather hope we never find any snails quite as big, those shown on the enlargement at the bottom. Slugs, do also occur on just a few paintings. There's one or two there showing slugs. Snails, of course, are very well illustrated. And this is an example of from pages from the very first illustrated shell book, which goes back to 1685, and these wonderful engravings of shells, some of them very large, some of them showing slugs. The one on the right is that same slug, the leopard slug, shown in its romantic embrace, shall we say. And then finally, I'm just going to show you one of my other interests is some shells appeared on stamps. The very first stamp in the world was from the Bahamas, which showed one of these queen conchs. And you may be interested to see the ones that occurred, our own British stamps, over the years, going back over 100 years now. The £1 stamp shows Britannia riding in a scallop shell, and then the bottom ones are more recent. I'm sorry to rush at the end, but I hope that has given you some kind of an overview of some of the more interesting facts of shells and snails and slugs. And I'd obviously be very happy to answer any queries you may have. Thank you very much for listening.